My straight roommate sent me to his older brother for 3 months. Then he chose me. Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into today's heartfelt story, I would like to ask for one small favor. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It only takes a moment, costs nothing, and helps us continue creating powerful, emotional stories for you. Your support truly means more than words can express. And before we begin, tell us where you are watching from today. Leave the name of your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now, let us return to our main character. Sometimes the place you never wanted to go becomes the only place that truly feels like home. I never imagined that losing my apartment would become the beginning of the most important chapter of my life. But that is exactly what happened. 3 months. That was all it was supposed to be. 3 months away from Portland. 3 months away from deadlines, crowded coffee shops, and the constant pressure to prove I was building the career I had always dreamed about. At least, that was what I kept telling myself as I stuffed the last of my clothes into a worn duffel bag while staring at the soaked ceiling above me. The burst pipe in my apartment building had turned my small studio into a disaster overnight. Water had ruined my furniture, my books, and the expensive camera equipment I had spent years saving to buy. My landlord assured me the repairs would take several months, which sounded less like reassurance and more like a reminder that I suddenly had nowhere to go. Hotels were too expensive. Short-term rentals were nearly impossible to find. My parents had retired to Arizona, and asking friends for a couch felt like admitting I had somehow failed at adulthood. That afternoon my roommate, Ryan, watched me zip my suitcase shut before leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms folded. "I have an idea," he said. "You're probably not going to like it." I laughed without much energy. At this point, unless your idea involves sleeping under a bridge, I'm listening. Ryan smiled. "My older brother owns a small lakeside retreat in Oregon. He could use an extra pair of hands for a while, and you've always worked remotely anyway. Stay there for 3 months until your place is fixed." I stared at him. "I've never even met your brother." "Exactly," Ryan replied, "which means he hasn't had time to get tired of you yet." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. "Very funny. Seriously, Nathan," he continued, his voice softening. "Grant is a good guy, quiet, a little stubborn. He spends most of his time restoring old cabins. He won't bother you, and honestly, I think you might actually enjoy slowing down for once." Slowing down. I wasn't sure I remembered how to do that anymore. My days had become an endless cycle of freelance design projects, client meetings, late-night editing sessions, and chasing opportunities that always seemed one step farther away than the week before. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped noticing mornings, sunsets, or weekends altogether. Life had become a calendar full of reminders instead of memories worth keeping. 2 days later, I pointed my aging SUV south toward Oregon with everything I still owned packed into the back. The farther I drove from the city, the narrower the highways became. Towering pine forests replaced office buildings. Cell service faded in and out. The air drifting through my open window smelled of cedar and fresh rain instead of traffic and asphalt. For the first time in months, silence filled the car instead of podcasts or phone calls. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. After nearly 4 hours on the road, my GPS announced I had arrived. I turned onto a gravel lane lined with tall evergreens until the trees opened to reveal a peaceful lake shimmering beneath the late afternoon sun. Several rustic cabins rested along the shoreline, their weathered wood glowing warmly against the water. A wide porch wrapped around the largest building, and flower boxes overflowed with bright summer blooms. It looked less like a business and more like the kind of place people dreamed about escaping to. I stepped out of the SUV, stretched my stiff legs, and looked across the quiet property. Before I could even reach for my bag, the front door of the main lodge opened. A tall man wearing a faded flannel shirt, blue jeans, and well-worn work boots walked calmly onto the porch. He carried himself with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. His expression wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't easy to read either. He studied me for a brief moment before offering a small nod. "You must be Nathan," he said. His voice was low, calm, and carried no hint of hurry. I nodded back. "And you must be Grant." Neither of us realized that this simple introduction would quietly begin changing both of our lives in ways neither one of us could possibly imagine. Never underestimate the quiet moments, because they often change your life long before you realize they matter. Grant stepped down from the porch with an easy confidence that made the entire property seem like an extension of himself. He reached for one of my duffel bags before I could protest. "Long drive?" he asked. "About 4 hours," I answered. The last hour felt like I had driven into another world. A faint smile appeared on his face. "That is one reason people keep coming back." We walked across the gravel path toward the main lodge, where the scent of fresh cedar drifted through the open windows. The building was simple but welcoming, with polished wooden floors, handmade furniture, and large windows overlooking the lake. Everything felt carefully maintained without looking expensive. It reminded me that beauty did not always come from buying something new. Sometimes it came from taking care of what already existed. Grant showed me a comfortable guest room on the second floor with a large window facing the water. "You can unpack whenever you feel like it," he said. "Dinner is usually around 6. Breakfast is whenever people wake up. We keep things simple here." I nodded, setting my bag beside the bed. "Ryan mentioned you could use some help. There is always something that needs fixing." He paused for a second before continuing. "But there are only 3 rules while you are here." I looked up with curiosity. "Only 3. First, everyone helps however they can. Nobody has to do everything, but everyone does something. Second, meals are better when they are shared, so if you are here, you eat with us instead of hiding in your room. Third, if you need quiet, the lake usually has the answer." I could not help smiling. That last one sounds more like advice than a rule. It probably is. After he left, I unpacked slowly, surprised by how quickly the room already felt peaceful. There were no traffic sounds outside, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. The only sounds were birds singing somewhere beyond the trees and gentle waves touching the shore. I opened the window and breathed deeply, realizing I could actually smell the forest. It had been years since fresh air had been something I noticed. A few minutes before dinner, I wandered outside to explore the property. Several small cabins sat among towering pines, each with its own porch overlooking the lake. Some looked ready for guests, while others were clearly waiting for repairs. Flower beds surrounded the walkways, and someone had carefully planted herbs beside the main kitchen entrance. Near one cabin, I noticed an older golden retriever lazily lifting his head before deciding I looked harmless enough to approach. His tail wagged with slow confidence as he walked toward me. "Well, hello there," I laughed, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "That is Cooper," Grant called from behind me as he carried a toolbox across the yard. "He believes every visitor is here to see him." I think he might be right. Cooper leaned against my leg as if we had already been friends for years. "He has excellent judgment," Grant replied. Usually, there was something unexpectedly warm hidden beneath Grant's quiet personality. He did not waste words, but every sentence seemed genuine. During dinner, we sat at a large wooden table overlooking the lake. The meal was homemade vegetable soup, fresh bread, grilled chicken, and a simple salad picked from the garden behind the lodge. I could not remember the last time I had eaten without checking emails between bites. "Ryan said you work in digital design," Grant said while pouring iced tea into our glasses. "Mostly websites and branding," I answered. "Freelance keeps the schedule unpredictable." He nodded thoughtfully. "Our website could use help whenever you have time. Most guests still find us through recommendations." I looked toward the cabins outside the window. This place deserves to be seen by more people. Grant remained quiet for a moment before answering. "I have never been very good at telling people what makes this place special." I glanced around the peaceful dining room, then toward the lake glowing beneath the evening sun. "Maybe the place tells the story by itself," I said softly. Grant met my eyes for just a moment before looking back outside. Maybe, he answered. At that moment, neither of us understood that those simple conversations, shared meals, and quiet evenings beside the water were already beginning to build a friendship that neither of us had expected to find. The strongest foundations are not built with wood alone, but with the courage to trust someone one small moment at a time. My first week at the retreat settled into a rhythm that felt completely different from the life I had left behind. Every morning began with sunlight reflecting across the lake, a mug of fresh coffee, and Cooper waiting patiently outside the front door, as if he had already decided we were partners. Grant was almost always awake before sunrise. By the time I stepped onto the porch, he had usually finished organizing tools or making a list of repairs for the day. He never rushed anyone, but somehow everything around him moved with quiet purpose. After breakfast, we spent hours repairing one of the oldest cabins near the northern edge of the property. The cedar siding had weathered over decades, several porch boards needed replacing, and nearly every window frame required careful attention. Grant showed me how to remove damaged boards without disturbing the original structure. "Anybody can replace something," he said while measuring a new piece of cedar. "It takes patience to preserve what still has life left in it." I smiled as I held the board steady. "You make woodworking sound philosophical." He shrugged with a faint grin. "Maybe it is." As the days passed, I realized he approached people the same way he approached old buildings. He never tried to force change. He simply gave things time, attention, and room to become whole again. During our lunch breaks, I often worked on redesigning the retreat's website from my laptop while sitting beneath a towering pine tree overlooking the lake. The existing site looked like it had not been updated in years. The photographs were dark, the pages loaded slowly, and there was almost nothing explaining why the retreat existed in the first place. I spent hours taking new pictures of the cabins, the walking trails, the dock, and the gardens, trying to capture the peaceful feeling that could not easily be described with words. One afternoon, while searching for additional photographs to scan into the website, Grant handed me an old wooden box that had been stored in the back of a supply closet. "There might be something useful in there," he said before returning to his workbench. Inside the box were faded photographs, handwritten notes, and carefully rolled blueprints tied together with a weathered leather cord. Curious, I gently unfolded one of the drawings. It showed the original layout of the retreat, complete with handwritten notes in the margins describing quiet reading spaces, community gardens, and cabins intended for guests seeking rest rather than luxury. Beneath the sketches were two signatures. One belonged to Grant. The other belonged to someone named Michael Hayes. I looked through several more photographs and noticed Michael standing beside Grant years earlier, both smiling while holding freshly cut lumber in front of the unfinished lodge. They looked proud, hopeful, and completely unaware of how much life would eventually change. When Grant returned, I held up one of the pictures. "Who is Michael?" I asked gently. He became very still for a moment before setting down the hammer in his hand. "He was my closest friend," he answered quietly. "We built this place together." His voice remained calm, but I could hear the weight behind every word. He believed people deserved somewhere peaceful to breathe when life became too heavy. Not a resort, not a luxury escape, just a place where they could remember who they were. I listened, without interrupting. After a long silence, Grant continued. "He passed away several years ago. Finishing this retreat became my way of keeping that dream alive." I looked back at the old blueprints, suddenly understanding why every cabin had been restored so carefully instead of replaced. Nothing here existed by accident. Every path, every porch, every flower bed carried part of a promise that Grant refused to abandon. That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the pine trees and warm light danced across the lake, I quietly closed the wooden box. I had arrived believing I was simply waiting for my apartment to be repaired, but standing there with those old photographs in my hands, I realized I had stepped into a story that had started long before I ever drove down that gravel road, and somehow I had already begun to care about how it would continue. The hardest choices are never between right and wrong, but between what is valuable and what is priceless. Nearly 2 weeks passed before I realized I had stopped counting the days. My calendar notifications no longer dictated every hour, and my mornings had become something I actually looked forward to instead of rushing through. The retreat had quietly settled into my routine, and somehow I had become part of its own rhythm. Every repaired porch board, freshly painted window frame, an updated page on the website felt like another small promise that this place deserved a future. One cool afternoon, I sat beneath the large pine tree near the main lodge reviewing the redesigned homepage. The new photographs captured the golden light over the lake, families gathered around fire pits, peaceful walking trails, and cozy cabins surrounded by towering evergreens. Grant stepped onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of iced tea before handing one to me. He studied the laptop screen for a long moment. "It already feels different," he said. "It feels like the place people actually arrive at instead of just another business." I smiled. "That is because this place is not just another business." He nodded quietly without saying anything else. His appreciation was always simple, never exaggerated, and somehow that made every compliment feel genuine. Over the following weeks, inquiries slowly began arriving through the updated website. Some guests wanted a quiet weekend away from busy cities. Others wrote about recovering from burnout, family changes, or simply needing somewhere peaceful to think. Reading those messages helped me understand that Michael's original vision was still reaching people, even years later. One afternoon, while Grant and I were replacing the railing outside the lakeside lodge, the sound of tires rolling across the gravel driveway interrupted our work. A black sport utility vehicle came to a smooth stop near the entrance. A well-dressed man stepped out carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the confident smile of someone accustomed to successful negotiations. Grant quietly set his tools aside before walking toward him. "Grant Sullivan?" the visitor asked politely while extending his hand. "My name is Daniel Mercer. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." They shook hands, and I remained nearby, continuing to organize lumber while trying not to appear as though I was listening. Daniel opened his portfolio and carefully spread several architectural renderings across the hood of his vehicle. Even from a distance, I could see elegant buildings, larger docks, luxury guest suites, and landscaped pathways replacing the rustic cabins surrounding us. "This property has tremendous potential," Daniel explained. "With the right investment, it could become one of the premier lake destinations in the Pacific Northwest. We are prepared to make a very competitive offer." Grant calmly looked over the drawings without any visible excitement. "It is an impressive proposal," he admitted, "but this place was never meant to become a luxury resort." Daniel maintained his professional smile. "Dreams evolve. Growth does not erase the past. It simply creates new opportunities." Grant folded the architectural drawings carefully before handing them back. "Some opportunities cost more than money." Daniel studied him for a brief moment before speaking again. "You should at least consider what this could mean. Financial security, modern facilities, national recognition." Grant glanced toward the cabins, the gardens, and finally the peaceful lake beyond them. "People come here because none of those things matter once they arrive." The conversation remained respectful, but the difference between their visions could not have been clearer. After Daniel left, silence settled across the property once again. I walked over and leaned against the unfinished railing beside Grant. "That had to be a difficult conversation," I said. He let out a slow breath while looking across the water. "The offer would solve every financial problem this place has." I looked at him with surprise. "Then why refuse?" He smiled sadly. "Because if I accepted it, this would no longer be the place Michael and I built together. It would become something completely different." I followed his gaze toward the cabins where families would soon arrive searching for peace instead of luxury. For the first time, I understood that protecting a dream sometimes required saying no to the easiest solution. As the evening sunlight reflected across the quiet lake, I realized I was no longer deciding whether I liked the retreat. Without noticing when it had happened, I had begun hoping with all my heart that Grant would find a way to save it. Sometimes the silence between two people says far more than the words they never dare to speak. By the beginning of my second month at the retreat, Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm that no longer felt temporary. The morning started with coffee on the porch while mist drifted across the lake, followed by hours of restoring cabins or improving the website before sharing dinner at the long wooden table every evening. Without either of us mentioning it, Grant and I had become a dependable team. He knew exactly when I needed help lifting heavy lumber, and somehow I always knew when he needed a fresh cup of coffee before he ever asked. It was a friendship built through ordinary moments instead of dramatic conversations. The redesigned website continued bringing new inquiries every week, and reservations gradually filled the calendar for the coming months. Guests often left handwritten notes thanking Grant for creating a place where they could slow down, reconnect with family, or simply breathe without feeling rushed. Every message reminded me that the retreat was accomplishing exactly what Michael had dreamed about years earlier. One Saturday afternoon, several neighbors arrived to help repaint one of the older cabins. Laughter echoed across the property as people shared stories while working together. Watching everyone volunteer their time without expecting anything in return made me realize this retreat was more than a collection of buildings. It had quietly become part of the community itself. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Grant and I sat on the dock watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and orange. Cooper rested peacefully beside us with his head across my boots. "You have made this place stronger," Grant said quietly without looking at me. I laughed softly. "I only built a website and replaced a few porch boards. You helped people see what was already here." His words stayed with me long after we returned inside. For reasons I could not fully explain, hearing that simple acknowledgement meant more than any professional award I had ever received. A few days later, I was carrying fresh towels upstairs when I heard Ryan's familiar voice through Grant's office door. He had stopped by unexpectedly on his way home from a business trip. I smiled, thinking it would be nice to surprise him, but as I reached for the doorknob, Grant spoke first. "The 3 months are going by faster than I expected." Ryan chuckled. "Nathan seems happier than he has been in years." There was a brief silence before Grant answered. "That is exactly why I cannot ask him to stay. He came here because he needed somewhere temporary. His life is waiting back in Portland." Ryan replied gently, "Maybe you should tell him how much he has helped." Grant sighed quietly. "He deserves to choose his future without feeling responsible for mine." I stood frozen outside the office. My heart sank as one sentence repeated itself over and over in my mind. He cannot ask me to stay. Suddenly every kind gesture, every shared meal, every quiet evening by the lake felt different. Had I mistaken simple kindness for something deeper? Had I started imagining a future that only existed in my own thoughts? That night I barely slept. The room that had felt welcoming only days earlier now reminded me that I had always been a guest. My apartment repairs would eventually be finished. My old clients were already asking when I planned to return. Maybe I had become too comfortable pretending this peaceful life could somehow last forever. Early the next morning, before anyone else was awake, I quietly pulled my duffel bag from the closet and began folding my clothes. Cooper wandered into the room and watched me with confused eyes before resting his head against my knee. I smiled sadly as I scratched behind his ears. "I know, buddy," I whispered. "I was only supposed to be here for 3 months." Outside the window, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the calm lake exactly as they had every morning since my arrival. But for the first time, the peaceful view no longer felt like the beginning of something beautiful. It felt like I was already saying goodbye to the place that had slowly become the closest thing to home I had ever known. The greatest acts of love often begin by giving someone the freedom to walk away. I had almost finished packing when I heard a gentle knock on my bedroom door. Before I could answer, the door opened just enough for Helen Foster, the retired schoolteacher who volunteered at the retreat every Wednesday, to peek inside. She had become a familiar part of life here, always arriving with fresh muffins, homemade jam, and an endless supply of encouraging words for every guest who crossed her path. She glanced at my packed duffel bag and frowned with quiet concern. "Leaving early?" she asked softly. I forced a smile that did not convince either of us. "It is probably time. My apartment should be ready soon, and I was only meant to stay here temporarily. Helen studied my face for a long moment before slowly shaking her head. Sometimes people hear only half of a conversation and spend days believing the wrong half. I looked at her with surprise, but before I could respond, she reached into the canvas bag resting on her shoulder and carefully removed a large craft envelope. Grant asked me to keep this safe until he was ready, she said. I think today is the right day. She placed the envelope in my hands and quietly left the room without another word. My curiosity quickly replaced my confusion. I opened the envelope carefully and found several folded architectural drawings along with neatly organized planning documents. Across the top of the first page, bold letters read, Future Leadership Plan. My eyes moved lower until they reached the names listed beneath the title. Grant Sullivan, Nathan Brooks. I stared at the page, convinced I had misunderstood what I was reading. The following documents contain sketches for additional cabins, expanded walking trails, community gardens, woodworking workshops, and seasonal programs for guests recovering from difficult periods in life. Beside nearly every proposed project were handwritten notes in Grant's careful handwriting. Nathan could lead digital outreach. Nathan's photography for guest stories. Build together over the next 5 years. My throat tightened as I continued turning the pages. This was never a temporary plan. It was a vision that quietly included me long before I had ever imagined I belonged here. At that moment, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Grant stopped in the open doorway, his expression immediately changing when he noticed the documents spread across the bed. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed gently and stepped inside. Helen always knows the exact moment to ignore my instructions, he said with a faint smile. I looked up, unable to hide the emotion in my voice. You were planning all of this? He nodded slowly. Not because I expected you to stay. He paused, choosing every word carefully. Because I hoped that if you ever decided this place felt like home, there would already be a place here that belonged to you. I lowered my eyes toward the drawings once again. I heard what you told Ryan. Grant leaned against the doorframe before answering. Then you also heard the part where I said I could not ask you to stay. I nodded quietly. I thought that meant you wanted me to leave. He shook his head. Almost immediately. No, Nathan. It meant exactly the opposite. You came here because you had nowhere else to go. If I had asked you to stay before you were ready, I would never know whether you chose this place or simply felt obligated to repay my kindness. His calm honesty settled over the room more powerfully than any dramatic declaration ever could. Everything suddenly became clear. His patience, his silence, his constant respect for my independence had never been distance. They had always been trust. I looked out the window toward the lake where sunlight shimmered across the calm water exactly as it had the morning I arrived. Only now I understood why everything here had slowly changed me. Home was never just the cabins, the forest, or the peaceful lake. Home was the rare feeling of being accepted without conditions and given the freedom to decide where my own heart truly wanted to remain. The moment you stop hiding your truth is often the moment your life finally begins. Neither Grant nor I spoke for several minutes after our conversation ended. We simply stood there as morning sunlight poured through the bedroom window, casting long golden reflections across the wooden floor. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt peaceful, as though years of unspoken fears had quietly settled into understanding. I looked once more at the future plans spread across the bed before folding them carefully and placing them back inside the envelope. You really thought about all of this? I asked. Grant smiled modestly. Only because this place deserved someone who could help it grow in ways I never could. I laughed softly. You are giving me far too much credit. He shook his head. No. I spent years rebuilding cabins. You helped people discover why they should come here in the first place. Those are different gifts, but they matter equally. His words stayed with me as we walked outside together. The cool morning air carried the familiar scent of cedar and fresh water. Cooper trotted happily beside us, completely unaware that the uncertainty hanging over the past few days had quietly disappeared. We wandered toward the dock without deciding to go there. It had somehow become the place where our most honest conversations always happened. Gentle ripples rolled across the lake while distant birds crossed the bright blue sky. Grant rested his hands on the weathered railing and looked toward the cabins scattered beneath the tall pine trees. "After Michael passed away," he said quietly, "I convinced myself that finishing the retreat was enough. I stopped imagining anything beyond that. It felt safer not to expect too much from life again. I listened carefully, allowing him the time he needed. Then you arrived carrying everything you owned in the back of your vehicle," he continued with a small smile. "At first I thought I was only helping Ryan's friend. Somewhere along the way, I started looking forward to every breakfast, every repair project, every conversation about photographs and websites. The retreat felt alive again, and so did I. I lowered my eyes, trying to steady the emotions building inside me. I thought I was the one who needed saving," I admitted. "I came here believing I had lost my apartment. I did not realize I had really lost my balance. I had forgotten how to enjoy ordinary days." Grant turned toward me with the same calm expression I had admired since the day we met. "Nathan, I never wanted you to stay because you felt grateful. I wanted you to stay only if, one morning, you woke up and realized this was where your heart wanted to be." I smiled, feeling the answer become clearer than it had ever been. "I already know the answer." His eyes met mine with quiet hope. "You do." I nodded slowly. Somewhere between replacing porch boards, photographing cabins, drinking coffee at sunrise, and listening to the wind across this lake, this place stopped feeling temporary. I took a slow breath before continuing. "More importantly, you stopped feeling temporary." Grant did not answer immediately. Instead, his smile grew warmer than I had ever seen before. He stepped a little closer, leaving enough space for me to decide what happened next. Without hurry and without uncertainty, I gently reached for his hand. He accepted the gesture naturally, as though neither of us needed to explain what it meant. The simple touch carried more honesty than any elaborate speech ever could. Cooper wagged his tail and settled comfortably beside us, earning an unexpected laugh from both of us. The sound echoed softly across the quiet lake, blending with the breeze moving through the towering pines. For the first time in many years, neither of us was carrying the weight of the past alone. We stood together watching the sunlight brighten the water, understanding that love was not a dramatic moment arriving without warning. It was built through countless ordinary days, quiet acts of kindness, mutual respect, and the courage to let another person choose you freely. In that peaceful morning light, I realized that the future waiting ahead of us was no longer defined by 3 months, a temporary arrangement, or an unexpected detour. It was defined by 2 people who had finally found the place, and each other where they truly belonged. The most meaningful dreams are the ones that grow beyond the people who first imagined them. The weeks that followed felt less like the beginning of a romance and more like the beginning of a shared purpose. Grant and I never rushed to define what had quietly grown between us because neither of us needed a label to understand it. We continued repairing cabins together, sharing morning coffee on the porch, and ending each evening watching the lake settle into silence. The only difference was that the quiet no longer carried uncertainty. It carried peace. One afternoon we gathered around the large wooden table inside the lodge with Helen, Ryan, and several longtime neighbors who had supported the retreat for years. Grant carefully unrolled the updated plans across the table, while I connected my laptop to a large monitor, displaying the redesigned website and new community outreach program. "I think it is time we stopped thinking only about restoring buildings," Grant said. "I think we should focus on restoring people too." Helen smiled immediately. "That sounds exactly like what this place has always been trying to become." Together we spent hours discussing ideas. We planned free weekend retreats for caregivers exhausted by years of looking after loved ones. We organized woodworking workshops where guests could learn practical skills while enjoying meaningful conversations. We expanded the walking trails with quiet reflection areas overlooking the lake. We created a community garden where visitors and local families could work side by side regardless of age or background. I suggested inviting former guests to share personal stories, about how the retreat had helped them through difficult seasons of life. Their experiences would become the heart of the website instead of advertisements. Grant looked at me with the same quiet smile I had come to treasure. "People trust real stories," he said, "and every person who leaves stronger than they arrived becomes part of this place forever." During the following months, those plans slowly became reality. Volunteers from nearby towns offered weekends to help build raised garden beds and repair additional cabins. Local businesses donated supplies for community projects. A retired carpenter offered to teach woodworking classes twice each month, while Helen organized book discussions beneath the old maple tree beside the lake. Families began returning year after year, not because the retreat offered luxury, but because it offered something much harder to find in everyday life. It offered genuine connection. One crisp autumn afternoon, I walked through the property carrying my camera, photographing guests laughing around a fire pit, children collecting colorful leaves along the trails, and older couples quietly reading together on cabin porches. Grant joined me near the dock where we paused to admire the activity surrounding us. "Do you remember the first photograph you took here?" he asked. I laughed. "The old porch with peeling paint." He nodded toward the busy retreat. "Now look at everything you helped people see." I shook my head. "We built this together." Grant looked across the lake before answering. "Michael used to say that kindness should never stop with the person standing in front of you. If it is real, it keeps moving from one life to another." I thought about the guests whose letters filled the office drawer, each one describing hope rediscovered after difficult chapters in their lives. Some had rebuilt relationships with family members. Others had found the courage to begin new careers or simply slow down long enough to appreciate ordinary days again. None of those changes came from one conversation or one beautiful view. They came from being welcomed without judgment and reminded that healing does not happen all at once. As evening settled over the retreat, warm lights began glowing inside every cabin while laughter drifted gently across the water. Standing beside Grant, I realized that love had become only one part of something much larger. Together we were helping create a place where strangers could arrive carrying heavy burdens and leave believing that tomorrow still held possibilities worth embracing. And there was no greater purpose either of us could have hoped to share. One year can change a place, but the right people can change an entire life. A full year passed almost without either of us noticing. The seasons had quietly painted the retreat with new colors, from the bright greens of spring to the golden leaves of autumn, and each passing month seemed to add another chapter to the story we had chosen to build together. The once weathered cabins now welcomed guests throughout most of the year, yet they still held the same simple charm that had first captured my heart when I drove down the gravel road with everything I owned packed into the back of my vehicle. The difference was never luxury. The difference was the feeling people carried home after spending time here. Every morning still began the same way. Grant brewed fresh coffee before sunrise while I stepped onto the porch with my camera, capturing the quiet mist rising above the lake. Cooper, a little older and slower now, faithfully followed us wherever we went, never missing the chance to greet new visitors with the same gentle enthusiasm he had shown me on my very first day. The community garden had grown beyond anything we originally imagined. Children laughed while harvesting tomatoes beside retired neighbors sharing gardening tips. The woodworking classes had become one of the retreat's most beloved traditions, filling the workshop with conversations that often mattered more than the projects themselves. Families returned every year, bringing friends who had heard stories about the peaceful little retreat hidden among the Oregon pines. The guest journals inside every cabin slowly filled with handwritten messages describing hope rediscovered, relationships strengthened, and quiet moments that reminded people how important it was to slow down and truly see one another again. One afternoon I stood inside the lodge organizing photographs for a new gallery wall celebrating the retreat's journey. At the center hung a framed picture of Michael smiling beside Grant during the early days of construction. Right beside it was a newer photograph of Grant and me standing on the dock surrounded by volunteers after completing another restoration project. Neither picture replaced the other. Together they told one continuous story about dreams carried forward by people willing to love them enough to keep building. Grant walked over and studied the photographs with me. "I think Michael would have liked this," I said quietly. Grant smiled with peaceful certainty. "I think he would have loved seeing that the dream became bigger than either of us imagined." That evening we walked toward the dock just as the sun began disappearing behind the trees. The lake reflected ribbons of gold across perfectly calm water, while guests gathered around distant fire pits, sharing quiet conversations beneath the stars. I slipped my hand into Grant's, and he gave it a gentle squeeze without either of us needing to say a word. We had learned long ago that the most important promises were often kept through everyday actions instead of dramatic speeches. Looking across the retreat, I remembered the frightened man who had arrived believing he was only waiting for an apartment to be repaired. I smiled at how little I understood back then. Losing that apartment had never been the real turning point. The real turning point was discovering that a home is not defined by walls, addresses, or how long you plan to stay. A home is created by the people who welcome you without asking you to become someone else, by the kindness that quietly restores what life has worn down, and by the courage to choose one another again and again through ordinary days. As the last light faded across the Oregon lake, I realized our story had never truly been about finding love. It had always been about finding purpose, finding peace, and discovering that the greatest gift we can offer another person is a place where they are free to belong exactly as they are. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by laughter, friendship, gratitude, and the timeless beauty of the lake, I knew that we had finally built something that would continue changing lives long after our own footsteps had faded from the old wooden dock.